Long before the Arctic appeared as a white void on our maps, the ancients filled it with imagination. They believed that far beyond the reach of the north wind lay a land of endless daylight, a place untouched by time or decay. The Greeks called it Hyperborea, meaning beyond Boreas, beyond the winds that marked the edge of the known world. In their songs and stories, Hyperborea was a paradise. The sun never set, the air was warm and clear, and the people who lived there knew neither sickness nor sorrow. It was the homeland of Apollo, god of light and music, who each winter left Greece to dwell among the Hyperboreans before returning in spring, bringing warmth and renewal. To the Greeks, the north was not cold or barren, but a mirror of perfection, a world in balance. For centuries, poets and historians repeated the tale. Herodotus wrote of offerings sent from this distant land to the island of Delos, passed from tribe to tribe as if preserving a root long forgotten. Pindar, writing a century before him, described the Hyperboreans as free from toil and old age, celebrating under clear skies. How could people from the warm Mediterranean imagine a land where the sun never sets, something only possible at the Arctic Circle? Did they hear of it from travellers who had ventured farther north than history remembers, or were they recalling a world that once existed before the ice returned? As time passed, Hyperborea moved from myth into maps. Medieval cartographers, facing the blank edges of the known world, began to draw what they could not prove. 4 islands, divided by rivers that converged at a magnetic mountain at the pole. They named this place after the legend, as if by mapping it, they might bring it back to life. But myths have long memories. Sometimes they survive because somewhere beneath the story lies a truth too deep to erase. Not written in temples or stone, but buried in ice. Beneath Greenland's frozen surface, scientists have found traces of ancient forests and flowing rivers, pollen from trees that once grew where no tree stands today. In Siberia, the remains of dwellings, tools, and even domesticated dogs reveal that humans once lived and thrived in latitudes long thought impossible. What was once myth now begins to sound like memory. Perhaps Hyperborea was never a kingdom of gods, but the echo of a real world, a civilization born in an age when the Arctic was green and alive, and the sun truly lingered in the sky. We may never know whether it stood as a city of gold or a continent of light. Yet its story endures, whispered across time, because it touches something ancient in us, the longing for balance and for the lost harmony between earth and sky. Tonight, as we follow the traces of that legend, we will travel through myth and map, through ancient words and modern discoveries, to ask one quiet question. Was Hyperborea only a dream of the past, or a forgotten memory of the earth itself? If you enjoy stories about ancient history and lost civilizations, do not forget to like this video, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. In the ancient world, the north was more a mystery than a direction. On early Greek maps, the lands above Thrace and Scythia simply faded into emptiness, a white space without contour or border. Yet out of that void grew one of the oldest and most persistent legends in human history. The Greeks called that place Hyperborea, a word that meant beyond the north wind. They believed that far beyond the reach of Boreas, god of cold air and storm, stretched a region bathed in perpetual sunlight. It was described as mild, fertile, and eternally bright, a world untouched by sickness or age. Pindar, the lyric poet of the 6th century before Common Era, wrote that the Hyperboreans lived free from disease and decay, rejoicing beneath the clear sky. Their days were filled with music and feasts, their nights illuminated by a sun that never truly set. A century later, Herodotus included the tale in history's Book 4. He wrote that sacred offerings once came from the Hyperboreans to Delos, the island sacred to Apollo. The gifts were carried in bundles of wheat and laurel leaves, passed from one tribe to the next, from the mysterious north through Scythia and Thrace, across the mainland, and finally to the Aegean. The Delian priests kept the tradition alive, though none could say when it began or who had first sent the gifts. For the Greeks, this story was not idle fantasy. It spoke of continuity, of a world beyond the known seas, still linked to theirs by ritual and faith. The idea of a land without darkness might have seemed divine, yet it matched something real. Above 66 degrees north, within the Arctic Circle, the sun circles the sky for weeks each summer without setting. The ancients could not have witnessed it directly, but the resemblance is exact. Somewhere, someone had seen it, and the story travelled south. Trade between the Mediterranean and northern Europe was already established long before the time of Herodotus. Amber from the Baltic and furs from the far north reached Greek markets by the Bronze Age. With those goods came stories of endless days, of rivers that never froze, of lands where the horizon glowed through the night. Those fragments may have shaped the legend of Hyperborea, a world beyond the wind, bright and distant, but not entirely imagined. Centuries later, evidence from the Earth itself would seem to echo those tales. Beneath the Greenland ice, scientists drilling for ancient air found layers of soil and pollen, birch, pine and willow. During the Eemian interglacial, around 130,000 years ago, the Arctic had been green, its rivers flowing freely beneath a warmer sun. It was a world of open water and forests, a far cry from the frozen desert we know today. Perhaps that was the true landscape that inspired the ancient myth. What the Greeks called Hyperborea may have been the memory of that northern world passed down through travellers and stories older than history itself. Each year, when the sunlight faded from Greece and the fields turned silent, the people said that Apollo, god of light and harmony, had left the world of men. He travelled north, beyond Boreas, to his true home in Hyperborea. When he departed, music ceased. When he returned, spring began. Callimachus, in his hymn to Delos, wrote that the island mourned when Apollo departed and rejoiced when he came back, bringing warmth and renewal. The cycle of his journey was the rhythm of the year itself, retreating in winter and returning with the sun. Later writers added greater detail to the god's northern homeland. Herodotus of Abdera, in the 4th century before Common Era, described Hyperborea as a vast island lying beyond the Riphean Mountains, roughly the size of Sicily. He said its climate was gentle and its fields abundant. At the centre stood a circular city, aligned with the stars, and within that circle rose a golden temple dedicated to Apollo. There the people held festivals without end, singing and dancing around the altar as the sun traced its slow path across the sky. Even the temple's design was symbolic. Its circular shape mirrored the motion of the heavens, the endless cycle of day and night that never truly broke. The priests of Apollo in Greece wore crowns of laurel in memory of that distant city of light. In Delphi, Apollo's most sacred sanctuary, the main axis of the temple faced north. An unusual orientation chosen, the priest said, to honour the direction of the god's journey. The connection between Greece and Hyperborea was more than myth. Herodotus's account of the offerings described a specific route through Scythia, across plains that later scholars identified with trade paths of the early Iron Age. Those routes linked the Aegean with the Black Sea and beyond. Along them moved amber, horses, metal and stories, the kind that transformed distance into legend. To the Greeks, the existence of Hyperborea was never in question. Its exact location remained uncertain, but its presence was felt in ritual, in architecture, and in the yearly return of light after winter. Apollo's northward flight marked not only the cycle of seasons but the link between man and the cosmos, between the world they knew and the world they could only imagine. By the 16th century, Europe began to redraw the shape of the Earth. Exploration and the rediscovery of old knowledge created a new desire to chart every corner of the world. Yet, one legend returned to the maps of that time, the legend of Hyperborea. On Renaissance globes and atlases, the far north was no longer empty. In its place appeared a detailed design of 4 large islands arranged around a central sea. Rivers flowed inward toward a mountain at the pole, and the surrounding ocean curved in spirals, as if drawn by an unseen force. The Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator produced the most famous of these maps. In 1595 he published Septentrionalium Terrarum Descriptio. It showed the Arctic divided into 4 regions, separated by great rivers that met at a magnetic mountain called Rupes Nigra, the Black Rock. In his notes, Mercator wrote that the seas drew constantly toward the pole, forming a mighty whirl. He marked settlements and named tribes on the islands, as if recording something remembered rather than imagined. Mercator credited an earlier source, a lost travel record called the Inventio Fortunata, written around 1360 by a Franciscan friar named Nicholas of Lynn. The friar claimed to have sailed beyond the north wind to a land bathed in constant daylight, divided by 4 rivers meeting at the world's centre, with a magnetic mountain rising at the pole. The manuscript was lost, but its details survived through quotations and letters among later geographers. Other cartographers followed the same model. The French mathematician Orontius Phineus in 1531 and the geographer Abraham Ortelius in 1570 each published world maps that repeated the same Arctic pattern. Across Europe, atlases labelled the region Hyperborea septentrionalis, the northern Hyperborea. The consistency across these works suggested that all drew from a common ancient source, perhaps the lost account of Nicholas of Lynn, or an even older chart that no one could identify. To Renaissance scholars, these images were not decoration. They reflected a belief that ancient civilizations had once known the true form of the Earth, and that their knowledge had survived only in fragments. When Mercator placed Hyperborea at the pole, he was attempting to connect myth with measurement. Even explorers of the Age of Discovery found the idea credible. Surviving letters mention plans to seek the northern islands shown on Mercator's map. Many believed that the polar seas might conceal a warm passage, or even a hidden continent beneath the ice. Centuries later, scholars such as Charles Hapgood revisited these Renaissance maps. In 1966, Hapgood argued that early charts, including those of Mercator and Phineus, could reflect coastlines that existed before the last ice age. He proposed that the cartographers had copied fragments of prehistoric sources made when the poles were ice-free. His theory remains disputed, but it revived attention to the repeated image of 4 islands converging around a mountain at the top of the world. Modern researchers have noticed that certain features on these maps roughly match known Arctic geography. The islands correspond to the Canadian archipelago, Greenland, and the northern coast of Siberia. The Central Sea falls over the Arctic Ocean. The magnetic mountain may symbolize the magnetic pole itself, whose shifting position the mapmakers could not explain. Whether coincidence or continuity, the resemblance keeps the legend alive. From the 14th century to the 17th, cartographers across Europe redrew the same circular design. As new exploration filled the polar regions with accurate data, the pattern slowly disappeared, and Hyperborea once again sank beneath the ice. What remains today are the maps themselves, their ink faded, and their edges darkened by time. In their swirling lines, we see how the cartographers of the Renaissance tried to measure a myth. They believed that every legend contained a fragment of truth, and that by mapping the entire world, they might rediscover the wisdom of the ancients. The dream of Hyperborea still lingers in those circles of ink and in the black mountain at their centre, a vision of the far north that refused to fade even when reason said it should. Long after poets spoke of a bright northern land, science began to uncover traces of the same story, not in verse but in ice. Beneath the frozen surface of Greenland, researchers drilled mile-deep cores of compacted snow to study the climate of the distant past. What they found echoed the old tales of warmth and light. The cores revealed that the north had not always been locked in cold. Within the layers of ice were bubbles of ancient air and fine bands of dust, each one recording a season of the Earth's forgotten history. The Greenland Ice Core project at the University of Copenhagen discovered patterns that proved the Arctic had once warmed dramatically. These events, now known as the Dansgaard-Oeschger cycles, showed that temperatures had risen by as much as 10 degrees Celsius in only a few decades. Such rapid warming meant that vast sheets of ice had melted, and forests had once grown where glaciers stand today. Deep within the cores, scientists found traces of pollen, the silent signatures of trees that no longer lived in those latitudes. Farther east, in sediments from Siberia and the New Siberian Islands, researchers identified grains of birch, willow and pine, species that now grow thousands of kilometers farther south. Their presence proved that the high Arctic for a time had been temperate and alive. Even beneath the ice of Greenland, the shape of that earlier world remains. Using radar instruments aboard aircraft, the NASA IceBridge mission mapped the hidden ground beneath 2 miles of frozen crust. The instruments revealed a network of buried valleys and riverbeds, channels that once carried flowing water toward northern seas. Some of those ancient rivers still faintly guide the motion of the ice above them. Geologists trace these discoveries to the last great warm period of the Earth, the Eemian Interglacial, about 130,000 years ago. During that time, global temperatures matched or even exceeded those of northern Europe today. Sea levels stood nearly 20 feet higher than now. The Arctic, far from barren, was covered in tundra meadows and sparse forests. Musk, oxen, mammoth, and early humans could have crossed it freely. Each finding added another layer to the image that myth had drawn long before. The ancients had spoken of a land where the sun never set, and the cold had not yet conquered the pole. The cores, the pollen, and the hidden rivers all pointed to that same vision, a northern world that once breathed warmth and light. The instruments of modern science had, without meaning to, given shape to the memory the ancients once imagined. The north had indeed been green, and its echo survived both in myth and in ice. The idea that Hyperborea might once have been more than a landscape, that it could have held real people, no longer seems impossible. Archaeology now shows that humans reached and thrived in the high latitudes far earlier than once believed. On the banks of the Yana River in northeastern Siberia lies a site known as the Yana Rhinoceros Horn Site, dated to about 27,000 years ago. Excavations uncovered dwellings built partly below ground to keep warmth, tools carved from ivory, and beads made of shell and bone. These were not traces of travellers passing through. They were signs of a community that adapted to the Arctic and remained for generations. Farther east, on Zhukov Island, archaeologists found the bones of domesticated dogs buried beside hearths nearly 9,000 years old. The discovery suggests early sled transport and the beginnings of winter trade networks that crossed the frozen coasts. The partnership between humans and dogs here marks one of the earliest of its kind, a bond that would later guide hunters and explorers across the entire circumpolar world. To the south and west lay another landscape that once linked continents. During the last ice age, a vast plain connected Siberia to Alaska, known today as the Beringia land bridge. Across that grassland corridor, herds of bison and mammoth roamed under cold but open skies. Genetic evidence shows that human groups also crossed there, spreading from Asia into the Americas. For thousands of years, Beringia acted not as a boundary but as a bridge between worlds. Together, these sites reveal a clear picture of people not merely surviving in the Arctic but truly living there. They built with what the land offered, using mammoth bone, ivory hides, and frozen earth. They hunted, traded, and travelled by sled across distances once thought impossible. Their settlements, tools, and ornaments speak of endurance, intelligence, and memory. When the Ice Age finally ended, sea levels rose and drowned the lowlands of Beringia, isolating the Arctic coasts once more. Yet, traces of those early lives remain. Hearthstones lie beneath the tundra. Tools rest in permafrost. The bones of dogs still mark the paths of those who once moved through the endless summer light. To scientists, these discoveries mark the birth of the first true Arctic cultures. To historians, they suggest that the image of a living, thriving north, the essence of Hyperborea, may preserve a fragment of truth. When the great ice sheets began to retreat, the people of the north followed the thawing rivers south. The land that had once glowed beneath endless light turned to tundra and sea. Yet something of it remained, not in monuments or names, but in the blood and language of those who left. The memory of Hyperborea, if it ever existed, did not vanish. It became a quiet inheritance written into the human genome, a trace of the lost north carried within humankind. In the frozen soil of Siberia, the story begins again. Beneath layers of permafrost near Lake Baikal, archaeologists unearthed the remains of a young boy buried 24,000 years ago. His DNA, later known as the Malta boy, revealed a genetic bridge between two worlds, part Western Eurasian and part ancestral to the first Americans. The discovery showed that people living in the heart of Siberia had already carried within them the mixture that would one day populate both Europe and the New World. The North, long thought to be a dead end of migration, had in fact been a crossroads, just as the myths of Hyperborea described a meeting place of light and life. Geneticists found further proof in the Y chromosome lineages of modern populations. The haplogroup Q, one of the major paternal markers, appeared in Siberian tribes and across the Americas. Its presence stretched from the Altai Mountains to the plains of Alaska and down to the Andes, tracing a migration that began in the far north. The route followed the same path later known as the Beringia land bridge, when Asia and North America were still one continuous plain of ice and grass. These journeys echoed the dispersal once hinted at in the stories of Hyperborea, of people moving outward from a land of light before it froze. Another thread appeared in mitochondrial DNA, the maternal side of inheritance. The haplogroup X, rare in Asia but common among some Native American and European groups, suggested a separate link between Northern Europe and early America. The pattern puzzled scientists at first. How could a lineage leap from one continent to another without leaving a trail through East Asia? One explanation again pointed toward the ancient north, a corridor across the Arctic that may have connected distant peoples long before the rising seas drowned their coasts. Each genetic line carried more than numbers. It carried direction, an echo of migration from a warmer Arctic, a record of where light and warmth once guided life. The farther researchers looked back, the more they found signs of an ancient exchange centered not in the south but in the top of the world. Even the roots of language seemed to preserve fragments of that memory. In the Indo-European family of tongues, the root bur means bright or white. From it come words like Boreas, the Greek north wind, Bharata, an early Sanskrit name for a luminous realm, and bright, the English reflection of the same sound. Across centuries and continents, the same syllable returned like a forgotten refrain, shaped by the idea of light itself. If myths are memories and language is their echo, then the idea of Hyperborea may be both, a genetic and linguistic trace of the first people who lived in the world beneath the eternal sun. The ice buried their homeland, but their descendants carried its reflection within them, in DNA, in words, and in the lingering pull that still draws imagination north. Long after Hyperborea had faded from the maps, something of its symmetry seemed to remain in stone. Across the ancient world, monuments rose that aligned not with the earth but with the heavens, as if humanity still remembered a geometry born under the light that never set. In central Germany, on a gentle rise above the plains, stands the Goseck Circle, a ring of wooden posts and ditches dating to about 4,800 years before Common Era. Archaeologists found that its gates face precisely toward the points of sunrise and sunset on the winter solstice. Each year, as the sun reached its lowest arc, its light passed through the southern gate and touched the inner circle. The builders had captured the rhythm of the heavens with astonishing precision, as though they sought to recreate the harmony once attributed to the northern land of eternal light. Far to the west, in Ireland, a massive mound called Newgrange carries the same idea in stone. Constructed around 3,200 years before Common Era, its long entrance passage remains dark for most of the year. But at dawn on the winter solstice, a shaft of sunlight pierces the doorway and travels straight along the tunnel, illuminating a single chamber at the heart of the tomb. The moment lasts only minutes, the first light of a new year falling into the oldest known architecture aligned to the sun. For many, it is a reflection of a cosmic order, an echo of the alignment once associated with Hyperborea's unending day. Thousands of kilometers away, deep in the Egyptian desert, another monument followed the same principle. At Nabta Playa, 6,000 years ago, nomadic herders arranged slabs of sandstone in patterns that matched the rising of Sirius and the movement of the summer solstice sun. The stones may have marked the beginning of the Nile's flood, the annual return of life to the desert, repeating the idea that the heavens ruled the earth. Just as the Hyperboreans were said to live in harmony with the sky, the Great Pyramid of Giza carried that legacy to perfection. Built more than 4 millennia ago, it faces true north with an error of less than 1/10 of a degree. Its axis aligns with Thuban, the pole star of Draco, known to the Egyptians as the immortal star. To them, it represented the point around which the heavens revolved, the eternal light that never faded. Such precision required more than skill. It reflected a worldview that joined architecture with astronomy, Earth with the cosmos, in the same spirit of balance that ancient legends gave to Hyperborea. Whether in the sands of Egypt, the plains of Europe, or the valleys of Ireland, The builders of the ancient world seem to remember the same lesson, that the light of the heavens could be fixed upon the earth. Across continents and millennia, the same patterns repeat: circles for the sun, gates for the solstice, stones for the stars. Together they form a lineage of memory stretching back to a time when people first looked north and measured the movement of eternal light. The myth of Hyperborea became legend, and legend became silence. Yet its reflection endures, in wood and stone, in geometry and light, reminders that humanity once built not only for shelter, but for the sky. By the 19th century, the world had been mapped and measured. The unknown edges that once invited myth were filled with names and lines. Yet even as science replaced imagination, a different hunger grew, the desire to reclaim lost origins. Among the spiritual circles of Europe, the ancient legend of Hyperborea began to stir again. This time, the light of Hyperborea would no longer represent harmony or balance. It would be reshaped into something far darker. In 1888, the Russian-born mystic Helena Blavatsky published The Secret Doctrine, a vast work she claimed was based on ancient wisdom preserved in the East. Within its pages, the myth of Hyperborea reappeared as part of her teaching about humanity's 7 root races. The second of these, she wrote, had lived in Hyperborea, a radiant people born before the fall into matter. To Blavatsky, the Hyperboreans were not mythic Greeks but divine ancestors, beings of light who had walked the earth when the poles were warm. Her intent was spiritual, but her words revived the name of Hyperborea and placed it again at the center of human origins. In the early 20th century, German writers such as Guido von List and Lanz von Liebenfels seized upon Blavatsky's vision. They turned Hyperborea from a lost paradise into the imagined cradle of a superior northern race, the original Aryans. Their writings claimed that this ancient people possessed sacred knowledge and purity that modern humanity had lost. The Hyperborean legend, once symbolic of peace and wisdom, became a myth of blood and hierarchy. By 1918, in the ruins of post-war Germany, a secret group called the Thule Society took shape. Its members, among them early figures who would later join the Nazi movement, blended occultism with nationalism. They revered Hyperborea as the polar homeland of the Aryans and adopted the swastika, once a symbol of the sun and life, as their emblem of rebirth. To them, the north was not just a direction but a destiny, and Hyperborea was their imagined point of divine origin. Their meetings spoke of hidden continents and vanished homelands beneath the ice. Some believed that the ancestors of the Aryan race had fled underground after a global cataclysm, preserving their wisdom beneath the poles. In this retelling, Hyperborea became a secret kingdom buried under snow, a justification for conquest disguised as myth. The harmony between man and cosmos that the Greeks once imagined was replaced by a vision of domination. As Europe moved toward another war, the obsession deepened. In 1939, under orders from the Reich's leadership, a real expedition set sail for Antarctica. The mission, officially called the German Antarctic Expedition, explored a sector they named Neuschwabenland. Its stated goal was territorial claim and resource study, but later accounts suggested another motive: to seek traces of the ancient polar homeland, the physical proof of Hyperborea itself. Aircraft surveyed the ice and dropped aluminum darts marked with swastikas, as if staking claim to the legend. There was, of course, no hidden civilization waiting beneath the snow, but the idea persisted. In propaganda, speeches and art, the North, and Hyperborea within it, became symbols of purity and strength, the axis of a reborn world. The myth, once sung as a story of light and eternal peace, had been twisted into a weapon of ideology. When the war ended, Hyperborea retreated again, into silence. Only fragments remained, faded documents, esoteric books, and maps stamped with symbols that had burned across a continent. The light that once meant wisdom had been bent, refracted, and consumed by fire. Yet even in ruin, the name Hyperborea survived, a reminder of how easily myth can be reshaped and how the brightest legends can cast the darkest shadows. In our own century, the story of Hyperborea comes full circle. As the planet warms and the Arctic ice recedes, science turns its gaze north again. This time, it seeks not gods or lost races, but the Earth's own memory, The tools are no longer compasses or esoteric charts, but satellites, radar, and cores of ice drawn from the depths of time. Yet each new discovery seems to echo the old legend of a northern land once filled with light. In 2021, scientists from the Greenland Ice Core project drilled through nearly 2 kilometers of ice and found something unexpected. Layers of preserved soil containing pollen and fragments of ancient plants. The samples showed that parts of Greenland had once been free of ice for long periods, perhaps as recently as 1 million years ago. The frozen island had not always been white. It had once been green and alive, much like the world described in the myth of Hyperborea. The following year, in 2022, a team writing in Nature reported the recovery of 2 million-year-old environmental DNA from sediments in northern Greenland. Within that genetic dust, they identified traces of birch, poplar, reindeer, and even horseshoe crabs, species that could not survive there today. From those fragments, researchers reconstructed an ancient Arctic ecosystem. Rivers flowing, forests spreading, and animals moving across valleys now sealed beneath permafrost. To many, this living portrait of the ancient North sounded remarkably close to the world once imagined as Hyperborea. Farther north still, sonar and satellite data revealed the Lomonosov Ridge, a submerged mountain chain stretching nearly 1,800 kilometers beneath the Arctic Ocean. Its rock samples suggested it was once part of an ancient continental crust, later split and drowned as the polar seas formed. Beneath the modern ice lay not emptiness but the fractured bones of lost lands, echoes of the Hyperborean world now buried below. Even the sudden rise of oceans bears witness to the end of that earlier age. Around 14,600 years ago, during an event known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, global sea levels climbed more than 20 meters in less than a millennium. Vast coastal plains vanished, and with them the lowlands of the north, perhaps including any ancient valleys or settlements that might have inspired the legend of Hyperborea. The flood that ended one world may have erased the last visible traces of another. Today, scientists map those hidden layers with precision instruments. Radar from orbit traces rivers beneath ice, drones measure methane rising from thawing tundra, and computers model the climates of vanished epochs. The Arctic, once imagined as the world's final mystery, now yields its secrets in data. In each new finding, the vision of Hyperborea emerges again, not as a mythic paradise, but as the scientific reality of an Arctic once green and thriving. As the ice recedes, the past rises. Beneath Greenland's glaciers lie ancient soils that once held roots. Beneath the Arctic Ocean lie drowned ridges that once touched the sky. And within those discoveries lingers the same image that haunted poets and cartographers for thousands of years. A world at the top of the earth, warm and bright, where the light never dies. The legend of Hyperborea may never be proven, yet it endures in another form, in pollen trapped beneath ice, in DNA of vanished forests, and in the rising reflection of the sun across melting seas. The planet, in its slow and silent way, remembers. And through that memory the light returns not divine, not mythic, but real, shining again over the north where the world once breathed green. Perhaps Hyperborea was never lost. It only sleeps beneath the ice, waiting for the world to remember. As the earth warms and glaciers retreat, the silence of the north begins to speak again. Beneath the frozen crust lie the traces of rivers, forests, and a sun that once never set. The ice has hidden not only soil and stone but memory itself, the quiet record of a world that lived before the cold. Every grain of pollen, every thread of DNA, every shard of bone is a fragment of that story. Piece by piece, the planet recalls a time of warmth and light, when civilizations looked to the heavens and measured the rhythm of the sun. Perhaps the ancients were not dreaming. When they spoke of a land where daylight never ended, they remembered something real, a green Arctic and people who lived beneath the eternal light. Now, as the north breathes again, that light returns, not divine but real, shining across melting seas and into the eyes of those who still look north and wonder. Hyperborea was never gone. It merely slept beneath the ice, waiting for the world to rediscover the truth that every myth begins with something real. If you enjoyed this journey through the brilliance of the ancient world, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Good night.